Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on language and psychopathology from an RFT perspective. This tutorial is adapted from the second part of Chapter 2 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. You can find other resources on the clinical applications of RFT at languageasintervention.com. In this tutorial, you will learn about problems linked to sense-making and motivation. So let's start with problems linked to coherence and sense-making. One of the typical issues we observe in clinical psychology is when clients are entangled in ways of thinking that restrain their flexibility and prevents them from doing things that are effective to meet their goals and needs. As we are going to see in this tutorial, this issue is directly linked to a central concept of RFT, the concept of coherence. To understand the concept of coherence, we're going to use a metaphor. When we don't have language skills, like when we were babies, the world is composed of elements that are not connected to each other in a symbolic way. It's a bit like looking at the sky at night and seeing all the stars. It seems that they are randomly situated in the universe. But as we begin to use language to relate things, elements that were separated from each other begin to enter networks of relations. Once we have language skills, everything we notice is integrated into a network. It's like building constellations based on shapes and symbols. So our experiences are not random anymore, we organize them in a way that makes sense. What's important to understand is that language is inherently coherent. Indeed, language is a symbolic system that requires that we build and derive consistent relations. When I say A equal B, B needs to be equal to A. Or else there is no mutual entailment, and thus A is not a symbol for B and vice versa. So as soon as we name an experience, it becomes coherent in the sense that it is now included into a network where derivation is possible. That's the most basic level of coherence. Note that even when we don't know the name of an experience or when we don't know how to make sense of it, we generally still end up categorizing it, for example by saying, it doesn't make sense, or I don't know what this thing is. By doing so, we actually integrate this experience into our symbolic networks. It's now in the category of things we don't know or things that don't make sense. From an RFT perspective, this is still the process of establishing coherence. Given that coherence is necessary for language to work, a lack of coherence in our networks is perceived as a problem that needs to be resolved. It's like when you have a conversation with somebody and at some point you realize that one word you've been using for a few minutes doesn't mean the same thing to you and to the person you are talking to. It disrupts communication. We would have the same problem if I started to speak in French here. That would still be coherent from my perspective, but it wouldn't be from yours, except if you speak French, of course. Because you would not be able to derive the meaning of the sounds I form with my voice. If I did that, you would probably send me messages to ask me to speak English, or you would have to learn French. That would be a way of restoring coherence. So, given that language is so helpful in our human lives, and given that coherence is necessary for language to work, incoherence tends to be aversive and coherence desirable. Coherence is necessary for language to work, but coherence can be misguided. Indeed, there are different ways of achieving coherence, and some of these ways tend to create more entanglement and less effective responding. One typical way that leads to problem is what we call essential coherence. This is what happens when we create intrinsic relations between symbols and features of the world. Let's take an example. Do you know what this word means in French? It means bread. So there is a frame of coordination between the word pain and actual bread made of flour. But this coordination is just symbolic. I don't need to find reasons inside the word that explain and prove why it means bread. If I did that, then I would be stuck when I need to use this word in another context, like when learning English, because I couldn't accept that the same word can mean something else than bread. In English, it means pain, so it's very different. Okay, does that seem trivial to you? Think about it. Many of the beliefs we hold true are driven by essential coherence. Our network is internally coherent, and it is seen as intrinsically equivalent to the world. In other words, the network is supposed to describe the world as it essentially is. Look at this guy who says that marriage means a man plus a woman. For him, marriage is intrinsically equivalent to the union of a man and a woman. And look at how we intrinsically frame ourselves in coordination with certain features. If these features are intrinsically me, then I am naturally limited in my responses. There are things I can do because I really am not self-confident. For example, so this way of thinking is coherent, but it limits my range of possible actions, and it is independent of the utility of my responses. Another way coherence can be achieved is by building networks that fit with social norms. In this case, it doesn't matter how you make sense of your experience, as long as it fits with what is expected by a social source of reinforcement. It means that, in this case, there is actually no need for intrinsic consistency with the features of the world. You could even think and say crazy things, and think of beliefs developed in certain sects, for example. It doesn't matter as long as you comply with the social source of reinforcement. So you can link social coherence to the concept of pliance that we saw in a previous tutorial. When we follow rules because we are socially reinforced for doing so, regardless of the natural consequence of the behavior, it is a form of social coherence. The problematic consequence of social coherence is similar to what we saw with essential coherence. It's a loss of relational flexibility. You have to think and behave in a specific way only. It's a loss of sensitivity to direct experience. The natural consequences of our actions tend to be ignored. Think of some classic examples in social psychology research that show the effect of social coherence. The Milgram experiment, for example. In this experiment, participants align their actions with what is expected by some social authority. They become insensitive to the impact of their actions, or this impact is symbolically transformed to stay consistent with the overall conceptualization. In other words, even if we notice negative consequences, we comply because this is what we are supposed to do. Essential and social coherence are involved in many psychological problems. Typically, with essential coherence, we observe a high level of rigidity, righteousness, self-defensiveness, which prevent people from responding in ways that connect with what they care about in their lives. You see that in couples therapy quite often, for example. Partners hold on to the way they see the world as if it was intrinsically true, and so whenever there is a difference of perspective, conflicts naturally arise. Social coherence shows up typically in situations where clients are excessively influenced by social norms. They make choices primarily to please others or not to be punished by others. They persist in behaviors that don't bring much satisfaction, but the fact that these behaviors are in line with what is socially expected seems more important. Let's now talk about problems linked to motivation. Motivation is obviously a key topic in psychological issues. In many cases, it's the lack of motivation that constitutes the problem. But in other cases, it's more that motivation is misguided. We pursue goals that might bring some satisfaction, but can create greater problems. Let's explore the role of language in motivation. While for animals without language, motivation is generally limited to relatively immediate sources of satisfaction, humans with language can be motivated by things that are much more distant or even abstract. We saw in previous tutorials that relating things symbolically can change the function of these things. So for example, when I work hard, I can relate working hard to distant consequences like making more money at the end of the month, or abstract consequences like being a good worker, acting with professionalism, and so on. Making money is not an immediate consequence of working hard, and it would be difficult for me to be motivated to work hard if I didn't have the ability to relate it to distant consequences through language. Being a good worker is not an intrinsic function of working hard either. It's a function added by language, a symbolic function. The advantage of symbolic motivation is that we can engage in actions that are not rewarding or might even be punishing in the short term and through direct consequences, but that will bring more satisfaction in the long run or at a more symbolic level, as when an action is motivated by a value, like professionalism. So let's take a detour by the RFT lab to see how RFT principles make sense of symbolic motivation. In an experiment conducted by Zhu and Hayes, participants learned that when a green light was on the screen of a computer, pressing the spacebar would make a pleasant picture appear, like the picture of a beautiful landscape or the picture of a delicious chocolate cake. Then the participants were trained to relate in equivalence the pleasant pictures to non-words and shapes that didn't have particular meaning prior to the experiment. It's the same principle we saw before, where some relations are directly trained and others are derived through mutual and combinatorial entailment. And finally, in the test phase, the green light was displayed either with the non-words and shapes in relation of equivalence with the pleasant pictures as you can see it on the left, or alone as you can see on the right. What the researchers observed was that participants pressed the spacebar more often when the green light was accompanied by a stimulus symbolically equivalent to the pleasant picture. In other words, the availability of a reinforcer alone is not as motivating as the presence of symbolic stimuli related to it. Okay, in even simpler terms, it means that we can increase motivation by contacting things that symbolize the desirable consequences. This is similar to my example earlier of working hard to make more money. If I can think of the money I will make at the end of the month, my motivation to work hard increases. The problem with symbolic motivation is that it can lead to adaptive peaks. An adaptive peak is a positive result of an adaptation that fails to provide a platform for advantageous future development. It's like reaching the summit of a mountain, loving the view, and being so satisfied that we don't see we could climb mountains that are higher. Perhaps it's okay not to climb higher mountains, but in our lives, we can get stuck because we find some satisfaction in an adaptive peak and fail to contact greater satisfaction because we can't see beyond that point. For example, parents might successfully punish a child when she has bad grades at school in order for her to have better results. And this could be seen as a good outcome. But meanwhile, this strategy might prevent the child from developing a desire to learn that will last beyond school. So, satisfaction is found to a certain point, but eventually the strategy is ineffective. Note that adaptive peaks can result from symbolic processes too, from non-symbolic processes too, like when someone is more sensitive to short-term than to long-term consequences. Think of someone eating a lot of chocolate cake, for example. In the short term, he feels good, but in the long term, he might feel sick. But because language can rapidly create all kinds of functions, the potential risk for adaptive peaks that take us away from other sources of satisfaction is even higher with language. And we see this risk in many psychological problems. For example, people suffering from anorexia often believe that they will be more liked by others if they are very thin. People who have an addiction to work might believe that working 7 days a week, 15 hours a day, will give them a sense of purpose and achievement. People who kill themselves often hope that death will bring some relief or even some satisfaction to themselves and to others. Obviously, nobody has had the experience of dying and observing the consequences on oneself, so these consequences are constructed by your symbolic imagination. The belief that being thin to the point of starving or that working hard to the point of burning out function in a similar way. Although there are probably some satisfying consequences that are directly experienced through working hard and being thin, a lot of the reinforcement that maintains these behaviors is symbolically established and not the natural results of these behaviors. So here is a summary of the main points you've learned in this tutorial and that I encourage you to remember. Coherence is a core property of language, which is necessary for derivation to occur in relational networks. When coherence takes an essential or social form, it can lead to rigidity, defensiveness, or excessive compliance, among other problems. Motivation can be symbolic, which allows us to engage in actions that are reinforced through distant or abstract consequences. Symbolic motivation can create adaptive peaks that are very far from direct sources of influence, which can lead to ineffective and rigid behaviors. This is the end of this tutorial on language and psychopathology. This tutorial was adapted from the second part of Chapter 2 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. If you want to watch the next tutorial on language and psychopathology focusing on the implication of RFT principles for the use of language in psychotherapy, you can go to languageasintervention.com. You will also find other resources on the applications of RFT for clinical practice.